This is the custom solution part of it. Key points for a custom solution. Compartmentalizing problem. We talked about it before. Start with the macro, work your way down to the micro. We said earlier, power is expressed from the core to the extremities through the interfaces, right? And that's going to inform the order in which we start to look at problems. Prioritize passive stress before active stress. Remove opportunities to train the wrong area or perform the movement incorrectly. Retest the client to assess their progress to see when you've actually solved the problem you've identified. Now, it's kind of hard to see here. You've got like a little whiteboard, I'm just doing that. Marker. Oh, I'll get a red one. So this is that little thing in the corner there. It's actually pulled from the movement breakdown. So
Quads.
at the top, we've got the core, interfaces, and extremities. This is where we start looking for problems. Right? We talked about before how power is expressed, the order. If there's a problem here, it's going to cascade that way. The interfaces won't be able to gain leverage properly. The extremities won't be able to gain leverage off the interfaces. Start here, look for passive problems. Once you've identified there's no passive problems, for active ones, which are going to be your proprioception and coordination are going to be the big ones you want to go over, because strength and speed are a product of your coordination and proprioception. Right? If you get here, find nothing, start moving to here. Depending on what the movement is, it's going to determine whether you want to go for the shoulders or the hips first. If I'm doing a deadlift or assessing a deadlift, I'm going to be looking at the hips first, right? Because that's where most of the work's going to be going. Shoulders not doing a whole lot. From overhead pressing, just doing a strict press, I'm going to start at the shoulders. Highly unlikely you're going to get through all of that and get to here and still want to solve the problem. Most of your work is going to be here.
Can I go through a case study with you then, just so I can understand it?
What's
We're
that?
trying to get passive and active a little bit. So like with core, like I have a girl and she has, obviously with core, she's got a lordosis. So that's, would that be passive? So it's the spine, the sort of lumbar spine, flexing. So it would be
Flexing or hyperextending?
Standing.
And then the active would be trying to get like glute function and getting that still basically back into it.
Right, so what part of the body are the glutes a part of? Right, yeah. So the thing with the core, especially when it comes to lifting, lifting with a flexed spine, lifting with an extended spine isn't actually a huge issue. It's the movement that occurs. So if you have flexion or extension under axial compression, that's when it becomes a problem. That's why you can do a round and back deadlift as long as you can get to the top and you're still there. You don't do that. That's when you start delaminating the annulus on the discs. So yeah, most of the time, the passive elements of the core, they're not going to be the problem. If they can do this, they get a pass. Whether they can maintain this is a whole other question. And because it affects whether the hips and shoulders can do their job, that's why we start there first. You don't want to go trying to solve a problem with the hips and shoulders if they're just flat out, because the core is actually all over the place, right? So we'll actually go through a case study and basically work through that process. We can sort of show it as a problem-solving mechanism.
That will help.
Yeah. Ryan talked about compartmentalizing. The idea that power and leverage are expressed from the core to the interfaces through the extremities, and how failure at one location increases stress on the other. So even if the core is good, but the shoulders are bad, the core is going to have to be working a lot more because it's going to become more unstable, right? And then the extremities, you're going to see that it's going to be much more apparent. As far as prioritizing stress, we just talked about start with the core, work to the interfaces, work to the extremities. Talked about prioritizing passive stress over active stress. Right. passive demands of an exercise exceed the client's capacity, you have to modify the exercise, right? It's basically a non-negotiable thing. You're not changing the shape of that bone or the length of it. It's a limitation you have to work within. However, exercises should exceed the active capacity of your clients. The question is whether it exceeds it too far, right? So it's like, I want a challenge, but I want a challenge I can do, right? You've got to get them there in steps. If the active stress is an issue, that's when we start looking at progressions.
By that, you mean the complexity of the movement that you've selected, right?
Normally, yeah. My process I'll normally go through as far as a regression. I'll start with the load first.
Yeah.
Then I'll look at repetitions. So basically going, is it a strength problem? Is it an endurance problem? If I drop those and they're still screwing it up, right, we've got a mechanical problem.
Yeah.
And that's when I start limiting the complexity. And that's what we're going to get into now. Talks, when we sort of started this section, we want to remove opportunities to train the wrong area or to perform the movement incorrectly. So the broomstick bow is a perfect example of both of them. Very hard to do it incorrectly because you have so much proprioceptive feedback. It's really useful if you're not PTing someone, you're giving them a program because they don't need you to watch them to know if they're fucked up. Point of contact with the head, shoulders, butt, shins. You lose any of those, you're doing it wrong. I'm yet to see someone be able to get down into that deadlift position that doesn't look like a great deadlift without breaking one of those rules. It's almost impossible to screw it up. That's ideally what we want. So you don't have to watch them. You don't have to worry about them getting stressed out and screwing something up. Remove their opportunities to make a mistake. So we've got two case studies we're going to look at. Kim, there's Kim, and Jules. Everyone know who Jules is?
Yep.
Yeah. So externally it looks like when you watch the movement, the fault appears exactly the same for both of them. But they're not. The problem's different and the solution's different. So I'll start with Kim. Kim switches over to the conventional deadlift, gets to a point where she's pulling the bar off the ground, gets to here, and that's the first thing that happens. Comes up to the top, straightens out the spine. Comes back down, and it looks perfect. So what's going on? Same thing with Jules. Pulls off the ground, rounds the back, gets up the top, straightens out, comes back down, and it looks great.
He has improved a lot, though.
Yeah, he has. So this is something
Thanks
that
to
I
you.
did with, yeah, this is something we did with Jules. I don't know if you can see it well from there. For Kim, the solution is negative deadlifts. For Jules, the solution is negative band deadlifts. Okay? So let's use this process and try and find out what the hell's going on. So we start with the core. Is it a passive issue? It's not. How do we know it's not a passive issue? Anyone? Well, it looks bad coming off the ground, but it looks good coming down. The passive requirements are exactly the same for both parts of the movement. So because we've seen her put the bar down, it looks all good, we know it's not passive. Right? We know the body's capable of getting there. So now we're starting to wonder, is it an active thing? Is it not? Can she get there? It's how does she get there? So let's think about the active side of it. Talked about the two primary things you focus on being proprioception and coordination for the active issues. What is the difference proprioceptively and with coordination between pulling a bar, doing the deadlift, coming up off the ground, and putting it back down?
The concentric, eccentric, like the different
The weight's the
muscle
same.
contraction.
That's not even close to Kim's 1RM. It's not a strength issue. The bar weight's the same. So what's the difference putting it down, picking it up? Fair enough, you can, eccentrically you can withstand a little bit more load in most movements than you can with where you have to produce a concentric force to move. So that could be it. But we want to find out what it is. So what about the proprioceptive difference? How much does that bar pull on you when you're on the top? Proprioceptively, it's very different to pulling off the ground. You're progressively told through more and more load and more leverage this is how you need to resist the bar, or that's going to happen, right? So when Kim starts at the top and goes down, that bar gives her feedback to find her way to the bottom correctly. So, it's not passive. We haven't even left the forward yet. Not passive, definitely not strength. Proprioceptive, maybe. Coordination, maybe. We know there's a big proprioceptive difference of pulling the bar up versus letting it down. Coordination, very different off the ground and coming up the top. You've got great proprioceptive feedback coming back down. You've got fuck all coming off the ground, right? So the issue for Kim was she doesn't know how to set up without any resistance on the ground. Solution, she knows how to do this. So we need to get her, we talked before about you need to know what right feels like so you know when you're doing it wrong. Negative dividends. Start at the top, come down. When that bar touches the ground, don't let go of the tension. Spend a second there, realise what it feels like, come back up. Cool. So over time, you get more and more familiar with what right feels like. That's pretty much it. Do anything after that?
Lots of broomstick.
Yes,
What percentage of 1RM do you need to do? We spent a full cycle, didn't we? What percentage of 1RM do you need to do to get that feedback? But it worked.
You know, like you just need enough that you can feel the weight.
Yeah.
Basically, like even with a 20 kilo bar, start going down there. You feel how you need to resist the bar.
Yeah. Assuming
lower extremities are doing their thing correctly. The bar's staying close to the body. Like I said with Kim, when she came down, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is how does she come off the ground? All right, what's the difference between coming down and going up? Very different feedback from the bar. Bottom you have none, top of that shitloads. And it gets progressively more difficult as she goes down. So basically she's just adding a piece of the puzzle as she goes further down. It just sort of builds up as she goes in. But off the bottom, you need to know what that right position feels like and trust that you have it. So when you stand up, it all looks good.
I find a lot of people that are not too experienced with the deadlift, say they've got 5 reps. The first one's ugly, and then the touch and go ones, the next 4 are all fine. So
right. What's the difference between the first rep and all the other ones?
There's an eccentric phase.
Exactly. Yeah. So you've got that. You've got your reference point after that.
Yeah.
The thing is, the broomstick bow can give you an idea of how to go through that range of motion. It can't teach you how to resist the bar. There's just no way.
That's right.
So what we did was we compartmentalised that problem. We started with the biggest, the thing that will sort of fuck up everything else if it doesn't work, which is the core. We eliminated passive issues. Then we started breaking down the active issues by trying to understand what happens at different phases of the movement. And then we tested it. If she doesn't let go of tension of the bar at the bottom and comes back up, does she still have that problem when she's coming off the ground? If she doesn't, it's not a strength issue, right? It's a proprioceptive issue. If she maintains that feedback, she's good. She got to the bottom and went to pull, and that happened again. She was holding onto the weight. Then we started to look at something a bit different.
I get them to set up. So then you start off with the bar, set like that, and maybe you're going down and then reach down and grab it and start.
I tend to teach, like I'm teaching new people a day that they'll get them set up from the top. But what I just said then, where if she got back down to the bottom, went to pull and then rounded, got a different problem. That's what drills have.
And the other thing you need to consider too is if you're working with, I guess just because someone's a seasoned lifter doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it the right way, but some seasoned lifters will set up in a conventional there. Yeah? Not in a sumo, they'll be nice and flat almost all the time.
And the requirements.
So if you were to go,
for sumo and conventional,
they
look very similar. But talking before, the big thing with the glutes is what is the angle of flexion of the hips. The difference between that and that is like double the angle, right? Really significant.
A couple of times I have their old their clutch, but their kyphosis is like this. So when they get into the deadlift,
they like that when they're standing up?
Neutral spine, they can stand like that. And I'll say neutral spine, and they'll try and get it back, they'll still have that curve, but that's their spine.
Yeah, the problem is that if they don't know how to do it without the bar, and then they set up that way with the bar down, like if you got them to do a broomstick bow and it was all fucked up, and then you put them on a bar, and it looks good, what's the difference between having a bar and doing the broomstick bow? They can pull themselves into position with the bar, so they can cheat the movement and make it look great from the outside. That's all I've done. So, as we were saying before, don't get distracted by the external look. Right, so the second one is Jules. Looks exactly the same. Pulls off the ground, back rounds. Gets to the top, straightens out, comes back down, looks perfect. Big difference between him and Jules. Jules is right at the top of his capacity, strength-wise, when he's committing this fault. So again, we go through the same process. Start with the core. Is it a passive problem? No. Why isn't it a passive problem? No.
This is joint closure. This is top. It's fine.
Right.
Back down.
Right. So for the same reason we know it's not for Kim. It looks fine when he's coming back down. So it's an active issue. Proprioception coordination. It's a little bit different in this case because I've worked with Jules a lot for a little while by this point. I knew that he could set up at the bottom in a deadlift. Right? At lower weights, it looks fine. So it's not proprioception, it's not coordination. He knows how to do it. So core is off. Go to the interfaces. Doing a deadlift, what's under more stress, the hips or the shoulders? Anyone? Hips? Yeah, massively. So let's have a look at the hips. Passively, does he have the range to get there with hip flexion? Of course he does. Because if he does it at lower weights, it looks exactly the same, but he doesn't commit the fault. So we know it's not a passive issue. He's got the range to get there. Is it an active issue? Does he have the coordination and proprioception? He does it lower weights, but when it gets heavy, it falls apart. We know he can resist it here because when he does it eccentrically, so again, it's not that core issue we're looking at before. So what can we do with the hips? Talking before about the gradient angle of flexion, especially when the loads increase, very difficult to keep those glutes on at the bottom. How do we test that? We palpate. Right? When we were doing the glute function test before, push into the muscle belly, feel if it's on or off. Basically, looks a bit weird. Basically, get Jules to do a deadlift. I just poke my fingers into the side of his butt. Get him to set up from the top and work his way down to pick up the bar. Good, 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 good. Glutes are on. As soon as that weight, once he has to start bearing that weight, glutes disappear. The hips aren't doing their job between here and here, so that rounds, right? Because remember where the hips actually have the spine, the sacrum goes straight into the hips, are essentially attached to each other, right? So the problem is a bit of strength, but it's actually a motor control issue. There's so much stress on him that he can't maintain that glute contraction under really high load. So how do we resolve the problem? Because I know that he can do it. Lighter weights, it's on, right? Heavier weights, all of a sudden it just disappears. So how do we deal with the problem? The solution was a negative band deadlift as opposed to a negative deadlift. We kept putting him on the same weights. We'd basically just be picking the scab and it would never actually sort itself out. It'd just be heavy, you'd get there and it'd go. What we needed was to buy him the opportunity to have his, not to be so focused on shit, that's heavy, that's heavy, that's heavy as he's standing up. Give him the opportunity to focus on maintaining that contraction. But we don't want to waste the movement. We still want it to be heavy for him at the top. So we use a reverse band. Bars on the ground, bands come up and attach onto the rig here. What that means is at the top of the movement, the bands start to lose more and more tension, the bar gets heavier and heavier and heavier as it gets higher and as it gets easier for him to maintain that contraction. At the most difficult part of the movement for him, the bar is the lightest because the band is placing enormous tension on that barbell. So what we've done is buy him the opportunity to focus on fixing that consistent contraction at the bottom because it's lighter, and as it gets easier for him, the bar gets heavier. Right? We could have just done it with lighter weight. You just waste that second half of the movement. And for anyone who knows drills, if you make them try and go backwards weight that's too easy for him, he cracks the shits, right? So you've got to find a way to make it work for fine. That one was much more involved. Does it make sense to people, sort of this process that we're going through, and realise that your ability to understand and solve problems through that process is heavily dependent on your knowledge of the movements, how you can describe the passive and active stresses in the different types of movements at the different locations and how they relate to each other, and how your client fits onto those, whether they do or don't. Cool? Any questions? Because that's really important. No.
If you are finding, well, and most of us will find stuff, and you're not sure, please ask. You know,
Oh, yeah.
ask me,
Oh, shit.
ask Sam, ask Al, ask Rach, whoever. Let's talk about the issue and see if we can't put our heads together and figure it out.
Because everyone tends to sort of, everyone has their own things that they're really interested in. You know, it might be like, yeah, I know shitloads about running. It might be like, well, I know everything about deadlift, a squat, and a bench press if you're Joe, right? If Joe wants to know something about running, probably go talk to someone that knows more about running than he does, right? And then you take that knowledge and now it's yours. It costs you nothing, doesn't weigh anything, and keep it for as long as you remember it. Lean on other people because they might see the problem differently to you and help you get to that answer. And that's the main aim. If we have time, I think we will have time too, because we rushed it through pretty quick. Once we've gone through the specific solutions, which will be more practical stuff, we want to go back and the screenings that you guys did, talk about some of the weird things that you found and how we might be able to use this process to address it. All right. There were 3 points, key points for a custom solution, which was that stuff we just went through. Al, do you want to give us one? 3 key points.
Make your problems a
Compartmentalize problems, definitely.
Then you want to follow the flow chart really, basically. So start with core.
Yeah, so that compartmentalization is that process essentially. So locations, types of stress, that's the order in which we're sort of compartmentalizing. Yeah, right. Compartmentalizing problems, which is understand the order in which power is expressed and use that order to start assessing your problems. At each location, assess passive stress before active stress. Do it the other way around, you're just wasting your own time. Remove opportunities to train the wrong area or perform the movement incorrectly, retest to assess progress. Right? And you basically just either get them to do the movement again if it's a movement specific thing, if it's something you found in the screening, redo that assessment from the screening and see if they scored better this time around.